Hi everyone, this is William Lee back with the fourth installment of the series The Romanov Dynasty of Russia. And today is a Wednesday. I usually post these on Saturday, but I have an easy week this week, so I'm able to do a midweek episode, which I've wanted to do all along. And now the question is if I'll be able to do a Saturday episode as well, but we'll see. So, in case you're interested in what I'm reading at the moment in the field of Russian history, it's this book that any of you who watch my series on Grand Duke Dimitri's 1906 diaries will be familiar with, because I also showed it there. So it's called Famine in Russia, 1891 to 1892, The Imperial Government Responds to a Crisis, by Richard G. Robbins Jr. and Columbia University Press. And it's an absolutely great book. And one of the things that Robbins does very ably is provide us a broader context by comparing Russia's response to famine with other countries' responses and strategies to dealing with famine, going all the way back to ancient Egypt and also to China, Imperial China. And so that's quite fascinating. I read that with great interest on various strategies for dealing with famine. And it's something that I wish in my dissertation on the Romanov Grand Dukes that I had included more comparison with other dynasties. That would have made things all the more interesting. But given that my dissertation covered more than 3 centuries, I didn't really have the luxury of doing that. And in fact, I had to cut my dissertation by almost a third in order to get it in just under the word limit that was strictly enforced. So yeah, I had to do a lot of cutting. Anyway, so today we are getting into very briefly Tsar Michael and going on to his son and heir, who became Aleksei of Russia, Tsar Aleksei of Russia. We can't really call him Aleksei the First, because alas, there was never an Aleksei the Second. So I'm told that Nicholas II, the last emperor of Russia, looked upon Aleksei Mikhailovich, Tsar Aleksei, as his favorite of all the Romanov rulers, and that influenced his choice of a name for his only son. But his Aleksei didn't get a chance to become Aleksei II, and even if the Bolshevik Revolution had not occurred, that would have been a very doubtful thing, given his hemophilia, that he would ever have been able to come to the throne and outlive his father. So I want to return briefly. So last time when we talked about how Michael came to the throne, Mikhail, how he was elected by the Zemsky Sobor, and how his father, who had been the original Romanov claimant to the throne, was forced to take holy orders and become a monk. And then during his son's reign, he also became the patriarch of the Russian Orthodox Church. His name was Filaret, and because he had entered the church in that binding way, he was not a threat to his son. And that being the case, his son even allowed him to assume the title Gasudar, and not just Gasudar, but Veliki Gasudar, so the great sovereign. So this is one of these interesting instances where you can't always tell by the title what the person's role was. There were times, for instance, when the title Tsarevich was used for someone who was not going to succeed to the throne. I think specifically of Grand Duke Konstantin Nikolaevich, who was the younger brother of Alexander II and was allowed to use that title, Tsarevich, even though Alexander II had several sons of his own. And his eldest son, or his second eldest son after his eldest son was killed, was very definitely his successor. So the Tsarevich, very definitely singled out as the successor. What's the word? Now I'm forgetting it. I should know it like the back of my hand, for the heir Tsarevich. Okay, never mind. So, Filaret was really dealing with the sort of political and administrative things while his son Michael was Tsar, and so he was allowed to take that title, Veliki Gasudar, the great sovereign. So when we talk about we can't call them the imperial family yet, because Russia is not yet an empire. This is Muscovy and Rus, not Russia. So when we talk about the royal family at that time, they were not so much an institution as they would become later one of the institutions alongside the state, the church, as they were sort of almost the family of the gods on Mount Olympus, you could say. And they would have considered me saying that blasphemous, I'm sure, because as we talked about last time, Muscovy and the Romanov dynasty were very much centered on the religious ideal, and the ideal of the sovereign as a stand-in for God on earth, not just someone appointed by God and possessing the divine right of kings, but a sort of stand-in for God on earth and having a measure of divinity himself. And the family also had this. This was also conferred upon them, so that they were kind of demigods, you could even say. So Godlo, one of my Russian sources, and I should have written down the full name of his article in the book Dom Romanovs, but he refers to the royal family at that time as a single sacred association, which is an interesting way of putting it. And Lindsay Hughes, my old PhD supervisor, notes when Tsar Aleksei died in 1676, the servitors were then required not just to swear allegiance to the new Tsar, Fyodor, but to swear allegiance to the entire royal family. So that's interesting as well. So that created a little bit of maybe grounds for prospective difficulty. Not at this time, but later on it would, because in this vision, this iteration of Russia as Holy Mother Rus, the Tsar was an absolute ruler, and in his sort of role as God's representative on earth, he had this not just a divine spark, but a divine spark in the sense of being creative, a creative spark, and that in the sense of being the only person who had a legitimate vision of what Holy Mother Russia was, and that divine, that sort of creative vision that he could then carry out, and nobody else, not even other members of his family, had a right to do that. But unlike ordinary people, they did have the potential to do that. They had the necessary sort of demigod status, and so that could make them a bit of a threat to the ruling sovereign. And the second thing that could provide some tension, of course, and you would have this in any royal family, is that the families image had to be upheld. The dynastic image and mythos had to be upheld. And so that was a determining factor in what their role was going to be and what kind of behavior would be expected from them. But that's all kind of very elementary stuff. So let's get down into the actual details. So Michael, Tsar Michael, perhaps we could call him Michael the First, since technically in the one instance after Nicholas II abdicated and before Michael himself renounced the throne, you could theoretically say there was a Michael II, but I'm digressing again. So Tsar Michael had no surviving siblings, apparently. At least there's no record of him having surviving siblings, so we can't talk about what kind of role the non-ruling males in the family would have played during his reign, aside from his father, who was outside of the family association by virtue of being a monk. Okay, so that unfortunately is something we can't talk about. There were no Grand Dukes under Michael. So Michael had several sons himself, and they all died except one. So the one son that didn't die was this Aleksei, who became the Tsar after Michael died. And since Aleksei only had younger brothers, and since those younger brothers all died in early childhood, again, we have no Grand Dukes to talk about and to see what their role would have been at that time. But it is very interesting to talk about how Aleksei came to be acknowledged as the heir to the throne, because I've emphasized several times now that there was no succession law. The Tsar could simply do as he pleased when it came to naming a successor. Anybody who he named as a successor would automatically have bestowed upon him that full creative spark and power. And he did not name Aleksei his successor formally, but what he did was that when Aleksei turned 13, he started making it clear that this was his chosen successor by the way he presented his son to the public. So, for instance, on one occasion, during the New Year's celebration in 1642, he seated his 13-year-old son on an ivory throne, and this was apparently the first time that Aleksei was sort of brought out for the public to see, and on this important occasion actually seated on a throne. And then when thereafter, when there were events that the Tsar appeared before the public, almost all of them religious events, Aleksei was at Michael's side. So this was by association, quite deliberately by association, that Aleksei was shown to the public as the heir to the throne. And then 2 years after him being seated on the ivory throne, he stood in for Michael, stood in for the Tsar at the theophany ceremony, which is a very important part of the Orthodox calendar. It's the ceremony where the waters of the Jordan are blessed, and some body of water is designated the Jordan for that purpose. And anyway, I won't go into that, but it's a very important event on the Orthodox calendar, and right up to the last Tsar Nicholas II, it would always be a big occasion for the royal family or the imperial family. They would gather at the Winter Palace all those years later, and the whole family would be there. And yeah, so for Aleksei, who was then 15, to stand in for his father was a very obvious signal to the public that he was going to be the successor. So this is something that I talked about in one of my daily videos on Grand Duke Dmitry Pavlovich, who lived from 1891 until 1942, that he was, at the age of 14, very explicitly in front of the public, associated, not a broad public, but some members of the public, associated with Nicholas II by leading a parade in front of Nicholas, and also then going with Nicholas, accompanying Nicholas to the officers' mess of the 2nd Guards Rifle Battalion, and also having been given by Nicholas to begin with in 1905 the honorary command of the 2nd Guards Rifle Battalion. And apparently this upset some people in the family. I don't know how the Empress herself explicitly felt about it. Her son was a baby at that time and already had shown signs of hemophilia, so they knew that he had this, what was at that time a terminal illness. So how did she feel about Nicholas displaying Dmitry, so to speak, as almost as a son and almost as a successor? But anyway, I hope you're watching those videos as well. Okay, and that is, so there are some very interesting points of of continuity between what was going on in the 1600s and what was going on in the early 20th century. All right, so as I said, he was never publicly and formally given the designation heir. The word I was thinking was naslednik Tsarevich. He was not given that title, but supposedly he was on his father's deathbed, Michael on his deathbed in his dying breath, so the story goes, declared Aleksei to be his heir and told Aleksei, "This is my command to you, that you take over as the Russian sovereign." And so at his own coronation, Aleksei actually made a point of rooting the legitimacy of his succession, in addition to the divine element of it, rooted it in his father's command that this was his duty to rule Russia as Tsar. All right, so now we talk about Aleksei himself. He himself had 6 sons, but despite that fact, he did not see fit to issue a succession law himself. So his second son was actually only born years after his first son had died. I'm not sure what age the first son had been. I would guess a child, because he was never brought out the way Aleksei himself had been by his father as an associate ruler. All right, so the first son dies, probably as an infant or small child. The second son is also named Aleksei. So let's call him Alexis. And he also was in his case, he was formally named heir to the throne. He had younger brothers as well. But once again, this designation was not made until he was 13 years old. So maybe those of you who have expertise on the British royal family, maybe, is the order of the garter, is that bestowed on an heir to the throne at a certain age? Is the heir to the throne made the Prince of Wales at a certain age. Now, this is something that I could have done a comparison to, although I don't know what state the British monarchy would have been in the mid, in the mid 17th century. The only perspective I can give you, the only context I can give you in what was going on in the world at large at that time is that you had the Salem witch trials, but that's not very helpful. Yeah, so anyway, I'm really digressing. So Tsar Alexei had 6 sons. The eldest died. The second was called Alexei. Let us call him Alexis here. And he was named heir officially when he turned 13 years old in 1667. But he only lived another 4 years, and he died when he was 17. And then the next eldest son was Fyodor, who would become Tsar after Alexei's death. So this this sort of begs the question, why? Why were boys not shown openly to be or designated heir to the throne before they reached 13 years of age? Well, one of the reasons was surely just because of high childhood mortality. It would be awkward to always be naming heirs to the throne as they died one after another. That would be not good for the dynasty's image, I'm sure. And the other factor is that a small child could not play this role of an associate ruler or a junior ruler accompanying his father and sometimes filling in for his father on important occasions when the Tsar would be in the public eye. And a small child simply couldn't do that. And so that was another justification, certainly, for waiting until the boy was 13. And I'm told, returning to that topic, that this was the case also in the Roman Empire and after that in Byzantium. And I myself have been reading Robert Graves's phenomenal 2 novels, I, Claudius and Claudius the God. And so you certainly have that. Augustus, for instance, and then Tiberius, they go through a number of successors, and the best way to tell who the successor of the moment is by what public roles the Caesar had given them. Okay, so yeah, a little boy couldn't really do that. And so even going beyond that, women and pre-adolescent children were hidden from public view in Muscovy. And women, there actually was a word, terem, T-E-R-E-M is the transliteration, that is related to harem. So it wasn't that Christian rulers had multiple wives. They did not. But the women folk, the female members of the imperial family, were kept out of view. And this was also true of boyars' wives. They did not have a public role, and in fact, they were kept out of view entirely, pretty much. I don't know if they ever made a public appearance. I kind of think not. But at any rate, this applied also to pre-adolescent children. So little boys were also kept out of public view, and apparently the reasons for this are a little bit speculative. I mean, maybe one of them was because you didn't want the public to be used to a child who would then die, quite possibly. Another one was because of the superstition, the fear of the evil eye. And another was the idea that there was a certain stigma attached to childhood because royals did have this demigod status in Muscovy and in Rus, and little children can misbehave and be silly, and so that would have undercut that image. And from what we know, from what I've seen in the sources that I've used that are secondary sources, I have not gone back and read material that actually was from the 17th century, records from the 17th century. But apparently in Aleksei's household, with his 6 sons, there was not even really any distinction made in terms of education or other things between the boys when they were little and when they were still outside of the public view. All right, so I've gone almost a half an hour, which I didn't intend to do. The next time we do have more information than in the previous generation. We don't know how Tsar Aleksei and his brothers were raised, but we do have records on how royal children were educated, royal sons, and the ceremonies around the birth of a royal child and that sort of thing. We do have records of that for Tsar Aleksei's children. There were numerous, and he had 2 wives, and he had children with both wives, and there are good records of that. So next time, that's what we'll dive into. In the meantime, I want to note 3 very accessible English language sources that I used when I was doing my research, in addition to the Russian sources. And these are all, I don't know if they're still in print, but they certainly are things that can be obtained. So one of them is a very good book by Philip Longworth called Aleksei, Tsar of All the Russias. It was published in 1984, and as far as I know, it's the only book devoted entirely to Aleksei. But I can't say that for sure. I mean, 1984 was a long time ago. Okay, the second book is Lindsay Hughes's Sofia, Regent of Russia. It was published in 1990, and in it she traces very interestingly how one woman, Sofia, who was a daughter of Aleksei, did come to have a very public role. All right. And then it's not a scholarly book, but W. Bruce Lincoln's The Romanovs, Autocrats of All the Russias, published in 1981. And I'm pretty sure that that one is, you can find it at used bookstores and that sort of thing. I want to say briefly, we're almost at the half-hour mark, but I want to say briefly, without going off on a rant, that the word autocrat in Russian Samoderzhavia is strictly a neutral term. So I don't like the way it's used in modern North American parlance to mean authoritarian, because it's like the word monarch. You can have good monarchs, you can have bad monarchs, you can have authoritarian monarchs, you can have liberal reforming monarchs, but the title itself has no connotations. It just has its literal meaning, which is self-rule or rule by one person. And so if we're talking about authoritarian movements and leaders, then please let's use the word authoritarian, and not make it the case that we can no longer use the word autocrat as a neutral term. I mean, anyone who believes in democracy is going to look at that term as being, and that phenomenon as being far from ideal, but let's acknowledge that it says nothing about the character or the way that the autocrat arranges his government, whether he does it to allow other people to have voices, even though he's the final word, whether he doesn't allow that, we don't know from the word itself. We have to look at the individual. All right, so that's enough from me for one day, and I hope you come back next time. Bye.